A house where parents don't stay. America in the early 90s was a very different place. Small towns felt like quiet islands in a sea of roads and forests, and news from the big cities reached them only occasionally, often a few days late. In one such town, Fairville, lost among the plains and old highways, stood a small orphanage. The building was dark brick, with a steep roof and narrow windows. Built in the 1920s, it always seemed out of place among the small wooden houses on the neighboring streets. The caretaker, Mrs. Grace, often joked that the house could be a set for a horror movie if only the cinematographer had enough imagination. But for the children, it was the only home they had ever known. In the main hall hung a massive clock that ticked incessantly, as if reminding everyone that time moved slower here than in the rest of the world. The children had grown used to its ticking just as they had to the smell of old wood and the dampness in the corridors. Among all the residents, one girl stood out. Her name was Sara. She looked about 8 years old, with a delicate face, large dark honey eyes, and a gaze far too mature for her age. The other children sometimes avoided her because Sara rarely played ordinary games. She often sat alone by the window, drawing in an old notebook. Her drawings were strange. Instead of suns or houses, she sketched shadows, blurred figures, and hands without faces. One day, a caretaker asked, "Sara, what are these drawings?" The girl answered quietly, "They're my friends. They're always with me." Mrs. Grace chalked it up to a vivid imagination. Every child in the orphanage invented some small comfort. But over the years, rumors began to circulate around Sara. She had been found as an infant at a bus station in a nearby town. There was no note, no belongings, just an old blanket. Social services never discovered her parents. From the very beginning, everything about the girl had a hint of mystery. Years passed. Some children were adopted, others were not. Sara remained. Several couples tried to adopt her, but something always went wrong. Once, a couple nearly signing the papers suddenly refused, claiming they felt a chill in the house when meeting her. Another woman was hit by a car before adoption could be finalized. The adoptions were handled by social worker Miss Taylor. Young, ambitious, and always determined to find children new homes, she, too, admitted, something about Sara was strange. "She's wonderful," Miss Taylor would repeat while flipping through files. "But, sometimes I feel like she's too old for her age. Her eyes seem to know more than they should." One autumn day, a couple, Mark and Alice Patterson, visited the orphanage. He worked at a bank, she was a music teacher. They had no children of their own and, after years of trying, decided to share their love with someone who needed it. Mark was tall and serious, always in a suit, but Alice had soft features and a warm smile. She was the first to notice Sara, sitting on the windowsill with a book. "What a beautiful little girl," Alice whispered. Mrs. Grace nodded. "She's special." When the couple approached, Sara lifted her eyes from the book. She didn't smile but studied them both carefully. Her gaze sent a chill down Mark's spine, but Alice gently squeezed his hand. "Hi, Sara," she said. "Do you like reading?" The girl nodded. "What kinds of books?" "Those where people are alone," Sara replied softly. Alice hesitated, then smiled. "You know, we sometimes feel lonely too. But when you have a family, it passes." Sara studied her for a long moment, as if weighing the words, then whispered, "We'll see." That same week, the Pattersons submitted their adoption papers. Their determination impressed even Miss Taylor, accustomed to endless rejections. Things moved quickly, and soon it was clear Sara would have a new home. The children at the orphanage were happy for her at first, but then one boy whispered to another, "They won't stay either." No one knew if it was a joke or a prophecy. The night before leaving, Sara couldn't sleep. She sat on her bed, staring out at the dimly lit moon through the misty glass. The room was quiet, all the other children were asleep. Then she whispered into the darkness, "We're leaving again, right? You'll be with me?" In the dark corner, where the faint glow of a street lamp barely reached, something seemed to stir. The first family. The Pattersons' house stood on a quiet street, with white fences and neatly trimmed lawns. Alice decorated the porch with yellow chrysanthemums, while Mark mowed the lawn every morning. For many, their home seemed the American dream, cozy, orderly, stable. Now, with Sara from the orphanage, that dream felt even closer. The first days went smoothly. Alice made pancakes for breakfast. Mark brought her new books from the library. Sara was quiet, polite, and well-behaved. She had a strange habit, always waking at dawn and sitting by the window while everyone else still slept. "She's like a little adult," Alice told her friends. "She doesn't cry, doesn't ask for toys, doesn't make noise. She just reads and draws." But soon, small strange things began to happen. First, the cat, Alice's fluffy favorite, disappeared. It usually slept on the couch, but one morning it was gone. Doors and windows were locked. Alice posted flyers around the neighborhood for days but never found it. "Maybe it slipped out when we weren't looking," Mark said, though he was puzzled. That same week, a vase broke in the living room. It had stood on the shelf for years but fell during the night while everyone slept. No footsteps, no slammed doors, just a dull crash that woke them. Sara walked into the hallway last, silently watching the shards. "You're not scared?" Alice asked. "No," Sara replied calmly. "They just want us to know they're here." Alice laughed at first, thinking it childish imagination. But something in Sara's voice wasn't playful. The next evening, Mark tried to install a new lock on the back door, just to be safe. But the screwdriver slipped from his hand and cut his leg. It was a shallow wound, yet it unnerved him. He was skilled with tools and rarely careless. At night, Sara would wake at noises. Alice often heard her talking to herself. One evening, she peeked into Sara's room and found her sitting on the floor, drawing while whispering. "I know. I won't go anywhere without you." The page showed dark outlines, something like a tall figure with long arms. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" Alice asked. "My friend," Sara replied calmly. "Always here." Alice's heart ached. She wanted to discuss it with Mark, but he waved it off. Children have imaginary friends. It's normal. Weeks passed. The air in the house felt heavy, charged. Lights flickered, doors closed on their own. One day, Alice came home to find Sara sitting at the kitchen table, broken plates on the floor forming a strange pattern. "What happened?" Alice shouted. "They're angry," Sara said. "Who's angry?" "The ones with me." A shiver ran down Alice's spine. She tried to warn Mark, but he shrugged. "You're overreacting. Sara's smart, she's just a little odd from the orphanage." The night that changed everything came in early December. Mark and Alice had invited friends for dinner. The fire burned in the fireplace, and the house smelled of roasted turkey. Sara sat quietly at the table, barely touching her food. When the guests laughed, she only watched them with her big, dark eyes. "Aren't you having fun, Sara?" one woman asked. "You shouldn't stay here," the girl said quietly but clearly. Everyone laughed, assuming it was a childish remark. But that night, after the guests left, the lights suddenly went out. Mark went to check the fuse box in the basement. A few minutes later, Alice heard his scream. She ran and saw him on the floor near the panel, as if shocked. Panic was in his eyes, his lips were blue. He struggled to breathe. "Sara! Call 911. Alice screamed. The girl stood in the doorway, watching. She didn't move. She only whispered, "I told you, they don't want anyone to stay." Mark didn't survive. Doctors later called it an accident, old wiring, a faulty panel. But Alice couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A week after the funeral, she awoke to the smell of smoke. Fire had erupted in the living room as if from nowhere. Flames spread quickly, blocking the exit. Alice tried to get Sara out, but the girl stood in the room, staring at the fire without fear. "Sara, hurry!" Alice yelled. "I'll stay with them," the girl said. Alice grabbed her and pulled toward the door, but fire cut off the path. Neighbors called the fire department, but by the time they arrived, the house burned like a torch. Among the ruins, only Alice's body was found. Sara miraculously survived. She was found unconscious in the garden, unharmed. Back at the orphanage. The same walls, the same clock, the same ticking. The children greeted her silently. Someone whispered, "I told you. They don't stay." Sara sat on her bed, staring long at the window. She whispered into the darkness. "Now it's just us again." And in the corner, where the wardrobe shadow fell, something seemed to answer her in a barely audible breath. The invisible companion. The orphanage had its own peculiar silence. It wasn't peaceful or cozy, it felt more like the pause before a storm. After the tragedy in the Patterson family, that silence became even more noticeable. The children whispered stories about Sara to one another, and even the adults avoided long conversations about her. "You understand, don't you?" Mrs. Grace said to Miss Taylor one day. "They all think she's unhappy. That there's some curse on her." Miss Taylor said nothing. She felt something similar herself, but she didn't dare voice it. Only a month passed before a new couple arrived, young people who had recently moved to Fairville. Their names were James and Rachel. He worked in an insurance company, she taught at an art school. They dreamed of having a child, but doctors had no solutions. When Rachel saw Sara, she felt a strange warmth. "Look at her," she said to her husband. "She's so calm. In her eyes, it's like an entire world." James hesitated. The girl's gaze seemed too sharp. But his love for his wife won out, and soon the papers were signed. Sara left the orphanage once again. Life with James and Rachel was almost perfect at first. A house with a garden, dinners together, walks in the park. Rachel tried to make Sara feel like a wanted child. The girl thanked her quietly, but always politely. "She's like aging backward," James joked. "Instead of playing, she acts like an old soul." But at night, the whispers began. Rachel would wake to faint murmurs. She would go to Sara's room and hear the girl speaking. "No, I don't want to go. You promised you'd stay with me." "Okay. But they mustn't know anything." When Rachel entered, Sara would quickly fall silent, only looking at her with wide eyes. "Who are you talking to?" Rachel asked. "My friend," the girl replied. "What friend?" "No one can see him. But he's always with me." A chill spread through Rachel's chest. She remembered her own childhood. She too had an imaginary friend. But something in Sara's tone felt too real. James laughed at his wife's worries for a long time. "Kids have imaginary friends. It's part of growing up. Psychologists say it's even healthy." But one day, he too sensed something strange. He was working in his office among papers when the door slowly creaked open on its own. He was sure it was Sara, but the hallway was empty. Then he felt a breath on his neck, light, cold, like a draft. He turned sharply. Nothing. That night he dreamed, Sara stood in the living room, holding the hand of a tall black faceless figure. Both of them looked directly at him. He woke and could not sleep for hours. Gradually, the atmosphere in the house changed. Rachel became anxious. She stopped leaving Sara alone at home. One day she found a drawing Sara had made of her and James. They were tiny silhouettes trapped in the hands of a large shadow. "Why are you drawing this?" Rachel asked. Sara shrugged. "That's how he sees it." "Who's he?" "My friend." Rachel tried not to show fear, but her heart raced. Tragedy came at the end of spring. They were driving out of town for a weekend in nature. James drove, Rachel sat beside him, and Sara in the back seat. The road was empty, the sky was clear. Suddenly, Sara whispered, "It's going to be loud now." At that exact moment, a van from the adjacent lane swerved sharply. James braked, but the car lost control and flew off the road. The impact was terrifying. When rescuers arrived, they found James and Rachel dead instantly. Sara sat in the back seat, unharmed. The police could not understand how it was possible. The entire car was mangled, yet the child seemed protected by an invisible shield. At the hospital, doctors examined her repeatedly, finding only a few minor bruises. "She's lucky," they said. But Miss Taylor, who came to take Sara back to the orphanage, felt that it was more than luck. Sara sat calmly, holding a notebook with new drawings. "On the way back," she quietly said. "I told you, he's always with me." Miss Taylor gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She did not ask another question. Deep down, she already knew the answer wouldn't please her. That evening at the orphanage, one of the children whispered. They didn't stay again. Everyone fell silent as the stairs creaked in the dark corridor, even though no one was there. Child dossier. Fairville was a quiet town, and a string of tragedies involving foster families couldn't go unnoticed. Police files on the deaths of the Pattersons, James and Rachel, and the Morgans sat in separate folders, officially labeled accidents. But one man couldn't accept it. His name was Detective Thomas Hayward. He had been with the department for over 20 years and had seen plenty: accidents, murders, fraud. Yet each time he read the files about Sara, something tightened in his chest. 3 families, he muttered to himself. 3 different tragedies. And each time, only one child survives. Colleagues advised him not to dwell on it. "You know how it is," the sheriff said. "Life is unpredictable. The girl's just unlucky." But Hayward didn't believe in coincidences. He started compiling his own dossier. On his desk sat a thick folder. Inside were photographs of the Pattersons' burned house, James and Rachel's crumpled car, and the suffocating basement of the Morgans. And always, a small medical report, child unharmed. He met with Mrs. Grace, who sighed and said, "She's special, Mr. Hayward. She never cries. Even when she learns her foster parents have died. She just sits by the window and waits." Waits for what? That's what I'm afraid to ask. He also spoke with Miss Taylor, the social worker, who looked exhausted. "You think I don't see it," she said. "But what can I prove? All the papers say accident. And my heart says, no, this is something else." Detective Hayward decided to meet Sara herself. He arrived at the orphanage and asked permission to speak with her. The girl sat in her room, drawing. When he entered, she looked up. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. "Yes," she replied calmly. "You came to look at the Morgans' bodies." Hayward flinched. How could a child know such details? "I just want to understand what happened." Sara studied him carefully and said, "They weren't supposed to stay. He didn't want them to." "Who is he?" The girl lowered her eyes. "You wouldn't like him anyway." Hayward felt a chill in his chest. He went home and spent hours reviewing his notes. Gradually, a pattern emerged. Wherever Sara appeared, death followed. He began investigating her origins. But there were almost no documents, only an old report stating that a baby had been found at a bus station, wrapped in a blanket. No prints. No witnesses. She seemed to have appeared from nowhere. The next week, he visited the doctor who had examined Sara after the Pattersons' fire. "I've been in medicine for 30 years, the doctor said, "but I've never seen anything like this." The child was at the very center of the flames, and she had not a scratch. "If I believed in miracles, I'd call it one. But something tells me, better not call it a miracle." Hayward returned home even darker than before. That night he dreamt. He sat in his office, and photographs from the dossier folder began to fall out. They formed Sara's face. She stared at him from the papers and spoke. "You still won't be able to stop me." He woke in a cold sweat. The next morning, Hayward decided to speak with his superiors. "We have to act," he said to the sheriff. "This child, she's dangerous." The sheriff scowled. "Tom, get a grip. You have no evidence. We can't accuse an orphan of killing adults. That would be madness. What if another family dies? Then it's another tragic coincidence. But the police can't fight ghosts. Hayward clenched his fists. He felt there was something bigger at work than mere chance, and he wasn't going to back down. That evening, he reviewed footage from the Morgan House cameras that the agency had provided. For a few seconds, in Sara's room, a shadow appeared, blurred, long, alien. Hayward froze the frame and stared. It seemed the empty eyes of the figure looked right at him. "My God," he whispered. "What are you?" In the dark corner of his office, where a lamp flickered dimly, something seemed to move. He spun around. Empty. But the sense that he was no longer alone lingered. Frames that disappear. Despite Miss Taylor's fears and Detective Hayward's warnings, the system kept moving. Sara was ready for a new adoption. This time, the Carters, David and Elizabeth, were interested. They weren't exactly typical parents, young, educated, fascinated by technology. Their home was fully smart, cameras on every corner, motion sensors, automatic locks. They explained to Miss Taylor. "We just want to feel safe. And, frankly, we know about the past tragedies. That's why we set up total monitoring. If something goes wrong, we'll know." Miss Taylor hesitated, but finally signed the papers. Sara found herself in a new home again. The Carters were sincere, but their kindness felt mechanical. She immediately noticed that every step she took was being recorded. In the room, kitchen, even the hall, tiny red lights blinked everywhere. "This is for our safety, dear," Elizabeth explained. "Now we'll always know you're okay." Sara said nothing. She simply sat on the floor and began to draw. The first few days were nearly perfect. The girl behaved politely and helped around the house. David reviewed the camera footage and found nothing unusual. But on the fourth day, he noticed something odd. On the footage of Sara playing in her room, a blur appeared for a few seconds, as if someone passed in front of the camera. Analysis showed no one else was in the room. David decided not to tell his wife. The next evening, Elizabeth approached him with a tablet. "Look." She showed footage from the kitchen. Sara sat at the table, and next to her, reflected in the refrigerator glass, was a dark shadow. "It could be a glitch," David tried to explain. "It's not a glitch," his wife said. "It's something else." They confronted Sara directly. "Who do you talk to at night?" Elizabeth asked, gently touching the girl's shoulder. "Him," Sara said plainly. "Who is he?" The girl remained silent, then whispered. "The one who always comes. He doesn't like you watching us through the cameras." Elizabeth shuddered. The next week, David discovered that camera recordings had begun to disappear. Entire hours of footage were simply gone, black screens with flickering static. "That's impossible," he muttered. "The system is autonomous, protected. No one could delete the data." That night, he decided to watch the cameras in real time. Sitting in his office with a laptop and a mug of coffee, he watched. At midnight, he saw Sara get out of bed and walk into the hall. A dark smear trailed behind her, not a blur, not a shadow, but something alive. David froze, unable to look away. Suddenly, the screen went black, and the office lights went out. Footsteps echoed from upstairs. "Elizabeth," he shouted, rushing upstairs. In the bedroom, his wife stood pale, eyes wide. "She was here," she whispered. "Standing by our bed." And behind him. David ran to Sara's room. She sat on the floor, drawing with dark crayons. On the page were two adults lying motionless, and above them loomed a long-armed shadow. "That's not us, right?" he blurted. Sara lifted her head. Her eyes glowed with a strange coldness. It already happened. The next day, an accident occurred. Police recorded a short circuit in the electrical system. The fire spread instantly across the second floor. Neighbors saw smoke and called the fire department, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. Elizabeth and David died from smoke inhalation. Only Sara emerged alive. She stood barefoot in the yard, holding her notebook. When firefighters asked how she survived, the girl replied, "He led me out." Detective Hayward arrived at the scene the next day. He looked at the charred house, clutching his ever-growing folder. "Another family," he muttered. "And again, she's the only survivor." That evening, he wrote in his notebook, "This is no longer coincidence. This is a system. And this system is connected to the girl. I must stop it, even if it means breaking the law." Back at the orphanage, where Sara had returned once more, the children whispered, "She's back. And he is too." This time, even the adults felt the darkness in the corridors grow heavier.